Ray Dalio has been discussing a cycle of New World Orders for the past few months. He believes that the current economic climate has already happened in the past, and that we can learn what to do by looking at the world economy's history. Ray Dalio is the founder of the world's largest hedge fund firm, Bridgewater Associates, which manages around $150 billion. We've covered Ray Dalio and his thoughts on the world economy cycle on our previous videos. And now, we will be getting an update on his views. In light of this so-called New World Order, investors can study previous happenings in the world economy and adjust their investments accordingly to protect their wealth from the upcoming downturn. This is critical as it could prevent millions and even billions of losses. Before we begin this video, we'd like to tell you how much we appreciate all the support you've been showing our videos. Stay tuned as we will continue to make excellent finance content for everyone. Join us in today's video as Ray Dalio explains this concept and what actions investors should take.
While the markets are behaving badly now because the same thing happened in the past. So, yes, studying history, learning the lessons, writing them down, modeling them. There's a template of what is happening. There's a story.
In this first clip, Ray explains how investors can protect their wealth and even profit from downturns by doing one thing: studying history. He claims that economic trends such as the current bearish behavior of the markets have previously happened, and that he has profited from this downturn through his study of history. In this following clip, Ray gives us an example of economic trends that have been repeated in history.
10 years later, so 1971, I was following the markets, and between graduating from college and going to graduate school, I was clerking on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. In that intervening period, there was a lot of aspirations, a lot of desire, to go to the moon, to eliminate poverty, to make equality in the United States, and so on. So in that early era, when there was Kennedy, and that made me an optimism. And then, but during that 10 years, the fact is that there was a lot of borrowing of money, a lot of deficits. Back then, gold was money. And money as we know it was like checks in the checkbook that would go get you the gold. You can turn in your paper money for gold, but gold was the real money. And because the United States had borrowed a lot more money than it had, it wrote a lot more checks than it had gold in the bank. And so on August 15th, 1971, when I was clerking on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, I watched on television as President Nixon defaulted on the obligation to pay gold for the cash. He went on and he said, you won't get the gold. And of course, he didn't say it that way. He said it in a way where it sounded like there were speculators and so on, and he had to do it, but he didn't get the gold. And so on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, I walked on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, and I thought the market was going to go down a lot because after all, this is a big crisis and the money as we know it ends. And I couldn't have been more wrong. It went up a lot. And what happened was I never went through a currency devaluation before, because in my lifetime, there was no currency devaluation. So that's the first time it happened. So I went back and I looked in history, and I found the exact same thing happened on March 5th, 1933, except rather than the television and Nixon, it was the radio and Roosevelt, and he made the exact same announcement and had the exact same effect. And at that time, I learned two big things. I learned that first, that many things that never happened in my lifetime seemed surprising at the time, and that I needed to study things that happened before my lifetime to understand them. So when certain things are happening, like right now, there are certain things that have never happened in our lifetime before, but happened many times in history. So in order to understand them, just as you said in the beginning, I need to understand the patterns, and even more than the patterns, the cause and effect relationships behind the patterns. So that mistake taught me that I needed to understand history. And there was, and each of the mistakes has taught me. I made a big mistake in 1982. I won't take you through it because it just probably take too long. But in other words, a big mistake in 82 when I calculated that foreign banks, American banks had lent more to foreign countries than those countries where they would pay back. There was a big debt crisis. I anticipated this debt crisis, Mexico defaulting, great, okay. But what happened is the economy, and I expected there would be a terrible economic situation. And you know what happened? The Federal Reserve printed a lot of money and it had the same effect.
Ray talks about a debt crisis that occurred in the United States in 1971 and the actions that then President Nixon took toward the economy. President Nixon was unable to pay the country's debt, which was supposed to be paid in gold. President Nixon announced this on TV, and Ray believed the market would crash. However, he was mistaken, and the markets went up. Ray was shocked by this occurrence because it was nothing he had ever seen. Ray then studied history to find a similar event, and he did. Ray found that the same event occurred in 1933 under President Roosevelt. According to Ray, Roosevelt made the same announcement as Nixon, and both announcements had the same effect on the markets. Ray concludes by saying that events that occurred before his time seemed shocking, and that he only truly understood them by studying the economic patterns of history. In this next clip, Ray explains what he means by New World Order.
I'll do that very quickly in a nutshell. And I also want to say that you don't have to read the book. I did an animated video which is on YouTube called The Changing World Order. And it's an animated, entertaining video that's about 40 minutes long, and it'll tell you the whole thing better than I can squeeze in now. But let me tell you. Okay, what's an order? Okay, an order is the system that's operating. How do you operate? So, for example, there is a domestic order. We have a constitution and democracy, and that's a system that operates, and that continues on until there's a war, and then there's another system that comes and replaces. Our system has lasted for a long time. There's also a world order, in other words, a world system. And that world system of operating comes after a war. Why does a war happen? Because conflicting parties of about equal power have a fight, and the dominant power wins, and then they get to set the rules. And the last time that happened was in 1945 because of the end of World War II. So, at the end of World War II, the United States had 80% of the world's money. Gold was money then. It had half the world's economy. It had a dominant military power. And for that reason, because it was the dominant power, New York is where the United Nations is. Washington, D.C. is where the IMF and World Bank, they put it there because it was the American world order. The dollar was the world's reserve currency, and that always happens. Before that, at the end of World War I, there was the Treaty of Versailles. And the winners of the Treaty of Versailles determined how the system was going to work after that. And if you go back in history, repeatedly, there is always a world order. There is always happens this way, and it continues. Okay, so how does it work? You end up with that world order, and then you come through a period of peace and prosperity because nobody wants to fight the dominant world power. So that there's peace. And then in that period of time, wars are sort of great equalizers. They reduce wealth differences, wealth gaps, and so on. And then there's a rebuilding process. And that produces prosperity and peace. Also, nobody wants to go back into the war. Everybody remembers how horrible they are. Before that, these cycles typically can take 100 years. Let's say they could take a lifetime. And then people forget because they weren't the same people. They forget how terrible wars are. After wars, people remember how terrible wars are and they want peace. All of those reasons produces peace and prosperity. And there's also a financial reorganization. But then that peace and prosperity leads naturally to the country that has that having the world's reserve currency. A reserve currency means it's the currency that's accepted. So naturally, the dollar is the world's reserve currency. Before that, it was the British pound during the British Empire. Before that, it was the Dutch guilder. It's the same pattern.
Ray first starts by defining what an order is. An order, according to Ray, is a system or a way a particular thing operates. He then connects this with world order, or world system, which is influenced by conflicts or wars. He says that after a war is won, the victor sets the rules and groundwork for the world economy. He gives the Second World War as an example. He says that when the US won the war, it had 80% of the world's money because they were the dominant power. This enabled the US to be the operations center for worldwide organizations such as the UN and the IMF. This example was termed the American World Order, wherein the US dollar was the world's reserve currency. Ray Dalio also stressed how war is a good equalizer for wealth gaps. Ray also briefly discussed the cycle between war and peace and prosperity and how it affects world order.
Prosperity with the world's reserve currency. Now, when you have the world's reserve currency, the rest of the world wants to save, and they save in that currency. And that leads the country who has the world's reserve currency to borrow. It gives them what's called the exorbitant privilege of being able to borrow and print the world's currency. Boy, that's a good thing to have. And then what they do, of course, is as prosperity continues and asset prices go up, like stocks go up and everything does really well, it encourages more borrowing and spending and betting on prosperity. And that begins to have a rise in levels of indebtedness. So you see debt levels rising. And the third thing it does is it creates greater wealth and values gaps. They become greater naturally. The wealth that's built up is distributed unevenly, and those who make a lot of money then begin to have a larger wealth gap, and that creates also an opportunity gap. If we're lucky enough to have the money, we can educate our children well and so on. That gives them an unfair advantage as in relationship to others. And so this wealth gap increases at the same time as levels of indebtedness increase. And then, of course, what happens is the competition increases. The competition increases because when you win and you have the other Germany or Japan or other countries destroyed after the war and there are no other competitors, then it's a dominant position. But over with time, others learn and begin to build up, like China particularly has increased its per capita income and its competitiveness. And so China is a competitor with the United States, but all through that time, it was like the British were competitors with the Dutch and so on. So we see that pattern happen over and over. As that power gap narrows, then conflicts about how things should go increase. And internally, there is a conflict over wealth and wealth gaps. And then there's a higher level of indebtedness, which makes for a worse set of circumstances. And that combination of circumstances leads to more conflict and more problems. So traditionally, you see that if you have a lot of levels of debt, the classic way that you see this is, what does a government do when it doesn't have enough money? It's not like they go into the coffers. The coffers are empty. They have no gold. They have not that money. So where do they get the money? They have to take the money from somebody else. That's either through taxes, or what they do, people get angry when they're taking it away and there's a big fight over it. So what they usually do is they print money. And through the Roman times, back in Roman times, they had gold coins. They put less gold in the coins. They put other metals in the coins. And inevitably, they print money when they want to spend more. And that, of course, produces the inflation. It devalues the value of money. And you lose buying power. And when that happens, at the same time, there's a large wealth gap. An opportunity gap, that produces a lot of internal conflict of the sort that we're seeing now. You always see populists of the left and populists of the right. What's a populist? A populist is a person who will fight for their side. They are not compromisers, okay? So that you see that you get to the point where there may not be compromise. For example, January 6th is right out of the populist playbook. In other words, fighting for power. It's entirely possible that we will see that neither side in the upcoming elections would accept losing. Okay, and there's a conflict. So you have that populace and that greater extreme of the left and the right. You have more internal conflict, and then as you have the rising power challenging the existing power, you have the world conflict. And then normally that produces a resolution, which happens through wars, because there's no world court that you bring your case to, and then there's a jury who makes a decision. It's typically through conflict. You have the next war, and you do the same thing over and over again. So that, by and large, is the pattern.
Ray further discusses what happens during peace and prosperity. He says that the country with the world's reserve currency, such as the US dollar, has the privilege to borrow large sums of money. Ray further explains using a graph in his animated video. First, as prosperity continues and markets go up, borrowing is encouraged, and this money is invested in the potential of prosperity. This then raises the amount of debt in the world and increases the wealth gap. Moreover, as the cycle continues, other competitors rise against the dominant power. An example of this is China, and how it competes against the United States. Finally, internal conflicts begin to grow between the dominant power and its competitors. The dominant power's debt levels also rise to unsustainable levels, and the usual response is the printing of money, thus resulting in inflation. The dominant power then loses its purchasing power. Internal conflict intensifies, competition rises to challenge the dominant power, and the possibility of international conflict or war increases significantly. A war happens and the cycle repeats, this time with a different dominant power and a new world order. In this following clip, Ray explains how power is quantified.
I measured 18. So that way you can watch the objective numbers. They're all measurable. Just like your, if you have a blood test and urine analysis and all of that other measure, you have measures. And the reason I need objectivity to be accurate, but also by being able to measure those things, you could see whether you're improving or not. So it's a type of biofeedback. But yes, you're right. What it starts with, for example, is good broad-based education. It starts with education. Educated people are more valuable, and there's two types of education. There's education of like what you know and what skills you develop, but there's also learning civility, learning how to behave with each other. How do you behave with others to make a productive society? And so related to that, as we think about that, think about parenting, think about the importance. Really, what I had was just going back to the basics. What I had was parents who loved me and were good guidance. I went to a public education, and it was public school, and it was a good public school. And I came out to a world of equal opportunity, in which there was an opportunity to make decisions and make things happen and then live the American dream. And really, those are the most important fundamentals. Like if you can get good guidance in your life, and you can have good education, and you have a system that provides you good and equal opportunity, I mean, that's basically it. Capitalism, it gives you the opportunity. People who say, that's a good idea, give you money to build it out. And so, and it's important to do that broadly for the population, because you don't know where the talent's going to come from. If you look at the best innovators, if you look at anybody who's been successful over a period of time, the Forbes 400 or something, and you look at those, many of those people came from the simplest, you never would have guessed where they would come from. And so having a broad-based population not only produces a higher level of productivity, which raises income and raises power, it also means that the individuals themselves have a fairer society, and they believe that the society is fairer. So these are fundamentals. And when you start to see that, then it's reflected in other things. It's reflected in inventions, in inventionness. So we measure how many innovations, technology innovations, what share of world trade the country has, a number of the statistics, and you could see that. And when the United States was dominant or the British that were dominant, they have a high percentage of world trade. And as a result of that, they have the world's reserve currency. So you see it reflected in the currency statistics. In other words, whose transaction? They have the world's financial center. In the Dutch Empire, it was Amsterdam. In the British Empire, it was London. In the American Empire, it was New York as the world's financial center. And so you see it reflected in all of those measures of power.
And military, as you try to protect your world power, in other words, your world trade routes, they tend to grow the largest military as well, because that's another form of power.
Exactly. I forgot to mention that. Of course, you're traveling around the world, just as you said. You have the trade routes. You're operating in your currency. You need a military. Okay. The United States, for example, has bases in 70 countries now. 70 countries. Okay. So you have to be a military power as a result. And all of these powers support each other. As you gain one, you get them also. You have to be a total power. Like the Soviet Union was never a total power. China is a total power. Soviet Union was never a total power because it was never an economic power. Okay, it had a military that was comparable in nuclear weapons, but it lost because it was never an economic power. So we have that kind of a situation. China now is a comparable economic power. So when we look at these measures, the United States in some ways is a little bit ahead in some and a little bit behind, but there's comparability.
Ray shows 8 measures of power. This includes the following: education, competitiveness, financial center, trade, military strength, output, innovation or technology, and reserve status. Ray stresses the importance of education and how educated people are precious. Ray says that education shapes a person's life and is the primary key to success. Ray further states that education is the key to innovation and technological advancement. Ray also shows a graph indicating how these 8 power measures perform as the New World Order cycle goes about. Moreover, Ray expresses the importance of a powerful military. With trade routes worldwide and global expansion, a dominant power needs a strong and capable military. Lastly, Ray mentions the importance of economic power, adding that the Soviet Union was never dominant simply because it did not have economic power. He further adds that although China is comparable to the US is still ahead ever so slightly. In this interview, Ray talks about how economic trends repeat throughout history. He also stresses how investors can take advantage of this and increase their wealth by studying the history of world economics. Ray also defines what a world order is and how the cycle of changing world orders works. Ray briefly discussed the economic process where new world orders are created. And finally, he explains the 8 measures of power and how they determine if a country is a dominant power or not. What did you think of Ray Dalio's explanation? What are your plans to survive this hectic economic situation? Give us your insights on this in the comment section down below. If you enjoyed this video, kindly like and subscribe. And we'll catch you on the next one.